Dr. Scott Cypers. I'm the Director of Anxiety Programs at the Helen and Arthur Depression Center. I'm here to talk to you tonight about your adolescent, what's going on, when to be worried, and what to do and how to help. I hope you enjoy my talk. Well, thank you all, and thank you for having me. And tonight's topic is about our teenagers. And basically the topic is about when should I be worried? Should I be worried? And so we're going to talk a little bit about, first off, a little about adolescence in general. Then we're going to talk about what is more typical behavior and when should I be more concerned about behavior. And then part of my work, as you heard, my history, I've done a lot of work at universities. So a lot of my work at universities was teaching faculty and implementing systems on how to deal with risk. So I've created this model called the stoplight model, and I'm going to introduce you to that today to be a useful heuristic to help you all make some decisions on what to do around issues with your children, your teenagers, and such. And then talk about, I call them tips and tricks from the trenches, but tips to help facilitate these kind of conversations that I'm going to challenge you all to have, and then talk about where do we go from here. So an ambitious agenda in a short amount of time. I always kind of over-prepare. But in that sense, we're going to plow away and let's see how we do. And really glad you're all here tonight. So in that sense, let's talk about adolescence. And there's a great slide that kind of captures that. And to think about the big thing about adolescence, it's a time of huge growth and change and rapid development in a lot of ways. And so you can even see in the picture that starting off right there and on the way out the store, the shoes are already breaking. Because so much change.
Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
We have an interpreter that can't hear through the lavalier. So if you can use the microphone, that's going to be a little harder, but that'll help them.
No problem. So I deal with anxiety, and one of my anxieties is talking into a microphone like this. So it's just really good practice with the light, the anxiety. I'll be schwitzing in a little bit. It'll be good stuff. Yeah, that might be a good idea. Can you hear me okay? All right. So that sense in that way, but to think about what's going on in adolescence. So the first thing that's going on, let's talk about what's going on in the brain. And in that sense, one of the things that's going on in the brain is this notion of growth and pruning. And pruning is this idea that these neurons are rapidly developing and taking shape. And the first big period of growth and pruning is sort of during early childhood. And that's when all that language development comes on board, so much rapid growth and change. And you even hear people talk about, that's why you should expose your kids really early to languages, because it's a sensitive, critical period in which these things come online and our growth and neurons are sort of taking shape. And we go through another one of those big periods in adolescence, where not only are neurons blossoming and growing, but they're sort of being defined and shaped in pathways that don't necessarily, if you don't do it then, that can be lost in that way. And then another big thing that's happening in the brain to realize is not only are these neurons growing and pruning, but it's called gyrification. That's where the grooves in your brain start to develop. But it's needed, and that's the point where our higher order thinking, our critical thinking comes on more online, our deep understanding of emotions, and two parts of our brain are really firing during adolescence. First off, our frontal lobe, which is all about that executive functioning, learning how to make good choices, learning how to figure out who am I, my independence, what I want to be, my values, my identity. And then your emotional brain is really coming online too. So these systems are taking on an added life at this critical period in time. And the intensity and sort of the creation of what's going to be is during this period of time. And that's why, just an added note, I'll take a quick aside, but then we'll come back. That's why when we add, and there's a lot of talk about marijuana on the brain, That's why marijuana for teenagers is very different because of these critical periods, and marijuana seems to impact these periods and take away some of these processes. So just to be aware of in that sense. So here's what's happening in the brain, and the mind is growing and all these things. So here's how this starts to translate in practical life. First off, you have this independent identity development. Who am I? And I want to figure that out. And I'm moving away from parent judgment and parent values to personal values. In that sense, I love this song by Fun. What do I stand for? This is that period of development that you're sort of figuring that out. And you're testing those boundaries. You're testing what's okay, what's not okay. You're creating more independence from people around you. You're finding your own people, your own groups. You're creating that autonomy, and you're testing your limits. You're testing what you can do, and you're really trying to figure out who am I in that process. So there's a lot going on. And so this is how it might show up typically, and here might be some signs it's going too far. So let's start with family and home and kind of what's typical. First off, it's typical to start having that separation from parents. So in that sense, if you say it when teenage years, it might be, oh, it's not listening, but it could be my wife jokes with me in the same way. She says, if I tell you it, it's not a great idea, but if your friend tells you it, it's awesome. That same kind of thing happens during that teenage years where they're trying to learn it and figure it out on their own. So they're starting to separate, so that might be some increased parent-child conflict. At the same time, because they're wanting to figure themselves out, they're moving away from family time and more time with peers. They want to be more around their peers. And again, they're becoming a little more overwhelmed with decision making because of all the stuff going on in the brain. And they might have a sense of increased argumentativeness, idealism, and some criticism of how they've been raised or what's going on. So these are some of those typical things you might see. I see some head nods, like, yeah, I see that. And that happens. But when does it kind of go too far? So when it goes and kind of crosses that line, when that kind of argumentativeness leads to verbal or physical aggression, or there's sort of this running away behavior, and they're causing a lot of trouble in that argumentativeness with peers, with teachers, and they're getting into fights, and especially fist fights. And again, if these beliefs start to manifest in more strange or bizarre ways, not just sort of politically, I'm leaning different than you, or ideologically around identity development, I have different beliefs about that. But when it starts to take on more strange beliefs that you can't make sense of, it might be time to start to put your antenna up. And then how it might show up in terms of sort of that boundary testing. So again, typical boundary testing is they want to explore the world around them, which includes drugs, alcohol, tobacco. They might try it once or a couple times. And that's kind of considered normal nowadays, but as I said, not necessarily advisable, but normal. And in that sense, they might test curfews, family rules, and what you're asking of them, and chores, and sort of taking it on their own. And then occasional white lies, really coming from a place to avoid an argument or a fight, and believing that it's okay to maybe stay out past 12 o'clock at night. That's an arbitrary rule. So I'm just going to tell you a lie because I don't want to cause a fight about it. So that might be, again, more of this typical behavior that you might see. But when does it become atypical? When you start to see, again, on the side of drug and alcohol use, more of this need for it and this sort of dependence on it. If it's becoming a daily habit. And the one thing I talk about with people or anything can become something that's abused. So if I'm using it as a way to cope with the world, it's probably a dangerous sign of maybe dependence, or in that sense, not using it in a healthy way. If I'm using it to add to an experience, like chocolate cake once in a while, that makes sense. But if I had a rough day and I'm eating the whole cake, I'm using it to try to cope, that's more of a warning sign that possible dependence or use or overuse of something. And again, especially as you see, using it to manage emotions, if you see sort of the selling of it, or a lot in the peer group of using it, your radar might be wanting to go off. And then problem behavior is unresponsive. So again, if you're having talk and consequences and you're trying to help your teen figure out what's okay and what's not, and they're not necessarily responding to consequences, that might be a time for your alarm to go off. And then in that sense where light lies or chronic lying, saying whatever, no sense of right and wrong, your alarm wants to kind of go up. So now risk-taking. What's typical? There's a typical need to increase with risk-taking, sensation, easy for me to say, sensation seeking. And in that sense, and some of that might look like speeding while driving, exploring sex and sexual experimentation, wanting to explore tattoos and piercings, skiing more wildly in Colorado. So these might be some things of where they're testing and they don't necessarily have that same level of awareness of life or death. They kind of in adolescence have a little more belief in their invincibility, which is really scary to you all as parents because they don't necessarily know how to recognize limits or long-term effects in the same way their brain is learning that now and doesn't necessarily have it. So again, when does it cross the line? It crosses the line when it looks more like recklessness, when there's no consequences, when they don't have concern about what they've done, or if they've hurt someone or hurt someone else. Again, experimentation in terms of sex, if they start having multiple partners, and especially if you hear it's unsafe, or going after that in ways that don't feel healthy, and not necessarily understanding if they get multiple vehicle accidents, or if they're really starting to explore firearms or different things, these are all signs for your alarm to go up. School environment. So from that sense, stressful school environment, again, can change, and there's a lot going on. They're thinking about college. Again, I'm blending my world with Amy's world, so it's coming together. But in that sense, a typical school transition, there's a lot going on in high school and adolescence because you're now thinking about the transition to college. Grades have more meaning, there's more pressure, there's more stress. So there's a lot more kind of riding, and that pressure is sort of now more typical in the school environment. And so you might see more concern about grades, more anxiety, more worrying, more moving away from things and having more hard time. But when does it really become a concern or cross the line? It crosses the line when there's that lack of connection to peers at school. There's a significant decline in performance. There's not coming to school, refusing to go to school, or suspension, expulsion, or dropout are sort of words kind of crossing that line. So now in that sense, body image. What's typical is becoming more self-aware because your mind is now more capable of doing that, more concerned about what others are thinking, what peers are thinking. So it's typical to be a little more focused on appearance and what people are thinking of us. But where does it cross the line? It crosses the line when you're really trying to alter your appearance, you're trying to do things to restrict your food intake or release food intake through binge eating and purging, and in that way doing excessive exercise, or in that way, if you hear signs around food in that way that I don't deserve to eat, that might be a sign of this other thing called depression, where all these things are going, and now you don't care about food in that way. So all those things might be signs of concern. And then again, as we talked about with anxiety in that sense, because all this is happening sort of your brain, you're comparing that pressure cooker of school, you're more aware that there's different pathways you're going to go on with college, you become much more aware, and we're sort of heightening this anxiety. And so it's normal to be more anxious and concerned in that way, but when it crosses the line is when it starts to impair, I call it kind of your ability to live, love, or laugh. When you're so concerned or worried about things that you're not going anymore, that you're avoiding these activities. It makes sense to be worried about prom, but if you're avoiding prom because of that worry, that's a sign, or your anxiety. It makes sense to be worried about the SAT, but if you're avoiding going to the SAT or doing it, that's a sign that it's going too far and you're carrying too much anxiety. So now that's kind of the anxiety world. And what I talk about is, because of adolescence and all this going on, this is sort of my take, if you have an overactive anxiety system, which is usually the gift of genetics and some other things, so your alarm, that anxiety part of your brain is going off a little more, and this frontal lobe of yours that's trying to develop is a little more heightened and very critical of yourself, and you get overwhelmed emotionally, that makes you vulnerable to this whole host of things that starts to happen more during adolescence, which we call mood disorders. And mood disorders are these things that can that significantly impact your functioning. So one of those mood disorders is depression. And when I talk to teens a lot, and my best example, we give another talk, think of depression like a virus. And in that sense, the best description of depression is, think of it like a Dementor from Harry Potter. It's this thing that sucks the life out of you. You feel, and all you're doing is replaying your worst experiences over and over. And in that sense, that's what depression is. Sadness, having a lot of moods and feelings, that's not depression. That's sort of normal adolescence. But if it's going on for 2 weeks, every day feeling down, there's no hope, there's no meaning, why bother, I don't need to eat, and all those things, is more of a sign of this sort of depression. And then another thing that can come online in that sense is, again, because of all this emotional stuff, we call it disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. So this is one of the ways it can go wrong, is when it's severe temper outbursts, and it happens sort of 3 or 4 times a week, and they're always sort of irritable and angry, and it's sort of disproportionate to what's going on. That's sort of disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And then another one is sort of the opposite. So when you have one of these sort of depressive periods, a lot of times this can start to show up as the other end of the spectrum, which is now called bipolar disorder. So not only do we have a period where we're so down like that, we also have a period then where we're really up. And it's not just kind of feeling happy, it's sort of euphoric and giddy and moving a million miles an hour and speaking really fast. And I, again, don't see any problem. And that's when I'm really impulsive and risk-taking and doing all these things that aren't typically me. That's a sign the other way. And it's something to be concerned about of when this can all go wrong. So in that sense, to think about, there's so much going on in adolescence. We just talked about it. And again, the question, should I be worried? And when should I be worried is a hard question to answer. But here's the facts. 1 in 6 adolescents are going to meet a criteria for a significant mental health issue that's going to impact their ability to perform in some way in their life. So what that means is, there's good news. That means 5 out of 6 kids, no, but 1 in 6, yes, which is still a very large number. So how should we tell? We've already started to give you some signs of when to be worried. But in that sense, I want to help you sort of further figure that out. So I call it the stoplight approach. And in that sense, the stoplight, think of it this way. Green are issues as a parent that are typical to adolescence that you feel comfortable to manage. Yellow, it's starting to get a little dicey and you don't necessarily know anymore and we want to consult. Red is I am concerned and I need to get some help in bringing some extra people to the team. And how do I differentiate that? So I'm a little bit of a math person, and so kind of really started to tackle this issue and think about it. So kind of develop this formula. So here's the formula. If there's a safety issue involved, it's automatically a red light issue. Part of that too, and how you might start to wonder if a safety issue involved, is starting to look at the number of symptoms and signs of issues, as well as the number of areas in your teens or life that start to seem impacted by what's going on. And I'm really a belief that if one area of life is impacted, we're usually still in the green area, but when we start to see multiple areas in someone's life start to be impacted, that's what starts to raise the color level. So sort of let's talk about what are some of those behavioral signs we want to look for. So first off, here are some of the signs. We want to look again, as adolescence is time for identity development, it's very normal to start to try to find your look. All of a sudden the clothes parents you were buying, I don't want to wear that, I want to go shopping for myself. They start picking out, that's not necessarily to be concerned. It's when, in that sense, it's so drastic and it just doesn't feel like them at all and there's a significant change, you want to just have your antenna up. But a big thing that doesn't necessarily change is if there's a change in hygiene. So again, if they're starting to have an odor, and not just from puberty coming on, but not showering, not taking care of themselves, when there's really a change in hygiene, start to see that as a red light issue. At the same time, their mood, and you start to see significant grade drops, that might be. If you're noticing really an increase, not that experimentation once in a while at a party, if I'm using it every night, I'm using it to go to bed, some concerns. Changes in interaction with you, peers, coaches, you start to hear from teachers you never heard before, I'm concerned about your son or things your daughter in that way. These are all sort of the things, that depression that we're talking about. A big one is if they start withdrawing, a loss of interest in activities. So not shifting to new activities, not concern, but withdrawing from activities, staying in their room, but not in a way like they're connecting to their friends, gaming, but where they're really dropping out. Those are signs of concerns. Red light immediately, if there's a change in speech, they're not coherent. If you're noticing cut or burn marks, loss of energy, they can't concentrate, you hear feelings of worthlessness, you hear them saying thoughts about death, I wish I were dead, I don't want to do this anymore. You start to notice a lot of anxiety, panic attacks. These are all some of the signs to look for. And when you're noticing some of these indicators, you want to start doing numbers. And that's actually how part of our way of figuring out what diagnosis is we ask questions around these symptoms, and certain symptoms cluster to certain disorders, and that's how we do this. It's not an exact science, but it's part of it. So these are some of the things you want to look for, but then as we said, you want to think about areas of life. So in that sense, think about there's these 6 areas of life. There's our academic side, there's our social side, our family side, and again, our career side, and especially for adolescents, that can be their sport or their outside job. And when things aren't going well in that, if it's contained, or our self, figuring out our physical and emotional health. And then that miscellaneous category is other parts like paying bills and things that might start to be impacted. But these are all the areas that are about our life. So in that sense, like we talked about, a green light issue, we're going to notice maybe 1 to 2 of these symptoms. They're going to be a little more transient, and only one area of life might be impacted. And the issue might seem more resolvable over time. A yellow light is, again, now we're starting to see more than one area of life get impacted, and we're starting to see more behavioral indicators, and the issue isn't seeming to just resolve. It's not over the week, I had a huge fight with my best friend, it's all over, and then sort of that's more transient, but if it's going on for 2 weeks and they're not doing anything, more of a sign. And then as we said, red lights, the key differential is you're now concerned about safety. There's some issue of safety involved. And when a red light issue is there, or when to put your antenna up, if you start to see multiple areas of life being impacted and multiple behavioral indicators. So when you start to see more, be more concerned, but you're going to have to fully, to figure that out, you're going to have to learn how to ask questions around safety, which we're going to talk about today. So here's the formula revisited. As you can see, what makes something a green light? No safety issues at all. A yellow light, you might not be sure. A red light, definitely. Number of symptoms, you can see, and the number of areas impacted and the length of time. And when you start to see these things, start to make some judgments of kind of where you are in this color system. And in that sense, I want to now give you sort of a heuristic of what to do and sort of the language you want to have based on the color that you find or you figured out. So how do you support? So all of them you're going to notice, it all comes from a loving place of a language of care and concern. I care about you, I'm concerned about you, but what follows is different based on color level. If it's a red light issue, it's no longer where your teen is in control, especially we'll talk about at higher levels of red. We'll talk about how to differentiate red. But it's a language of I need, you must, we have to, we need to, this needs to happen. It's more of a command language. And in that sense, you can talk about options, but this needs to happen. And again, parent, you have control. There can be some shared control with you and your teen, but if there's a red light issue, you need to have more control and more say in what's going to happen. And then who do you turn to? I would recommend everyone needs. So I have this too. When my kids have a strep throat or they're coughing, I have that doctor or that person I can call and say, hey, should I really go to the doctor about this? This is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm hearing. We want to have the same thing for mental health. You want to have that person you can kind of call and say, this is what I'm seeing. And if you don't, and you're hearing some red light issues, bringing them in for an evaluation to any emergency department so they can help tease that out. Or to any crisis center, there's a lot all over the city, or calling a hotline and helping them make that determination with you. But if they're in a red light, and we'll talk about the degrees in a minute, you want to make sure that they're safe and that you know they're going to be okay, which probably means they're not leaving your side till you sort of made sure that safety and imminent issue is crossed out. A yellow light, you're talking together, you're coming up with plans, you're working as a team. It's a team now. Let's come up with a plan together. Let's figure this out, and they can veto some of your ideas. It can be more that way. It's more of a shared approach. A green light, they're in control. They get to make the decisions. And it's always a language of care and concern, and you don't necessarily need to involve a team, but when you're at a yellow, you want to have those people you can consult with, and when they're at a red, you want to have people, if you can't figure it out, to help you figure out where they are in that red light spectrum. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, how do we figure out how the degree of red lightness? So I use a little bit, think of it like boiling water. So we're going to have our hot, our medium, and our warm. So this is sort of the continuum. A hot red, so a red hot, is where there's an imminent risk to safety, or you can't trust that your teen is making good decisions and they're impulsive and you don't know if they're going to be safe. That's an imminent risk issue. And you need to get help immediately, and they can't leave your side in a red hot issue. Where there's not immediate imminent risk, where you've ruled that out, you're still coming up with a plan of how to get them help, and you're helping them come up with plans of how do they get back to a yellow or green. And you're not letting them leave until you know they're more at a yellow or green. And then it comes to, this is also some preemptive work, is having some conversations before they're at a red light of what helps you get back, what helps you cope, what helps you. So if we're in that situation, we're not developing it, we are going to the plan we created. In the same way, you don't want to figure out what to do in case of a fire when there's a fire. You want to execute the plan you've been practicing and have developed in those times. So one thing I would encourage you is to have a conversation with them now of what helps you when you're really upset. What is our game plan if this might occur that we can agree to now, so that if we ever get in that situation, we can execute that plan. And if you can't execute the plan we've negotiated, it becomes a red hot issue. And we proceed to involve people to make sure safety's ensured. So again, we need to make sure they get connected as soon as they can, but it's not imminent. We get to their coping plan. We consult to know if I need to more act like a red hot, I don't know, or I can move to and keep moving. And if I can, we also want to, because of impulsivity with teenagers, if we're dealing with any red situations, or we have in the past, when they get to a red light, we want to take all the things we can use impulsively out of the equation. In the same way, if you were trying to lose weight, you don't want to have chocolate cake all over the house. That's harder to do. When you are trying to keep yourself safe, you want to remove sharp objects. You don't want to have pills around. It's not foolproof, but we want to make it harder and decrease impulsive action. So in that way, then the third issue, kind of the category, is warm, where you can see they have some mental health issues going on. They might be depressed, they might be anxious, but they're not issues of taking their own life or safety, and they're sort of refusing to get help. I don't want to go see the therapist. I don't want to see the counselor. You know they're depressed. That's substantiated, but there's not a safety issue or risk to life, and that's sort of the lower end of the spectrum. I have a disorder that could be treated, but I don't want to get help for it. And in that sense, you want to talk about what are the reasons why, what are the barriers. You want to help create a coping plan still. You want, in case it goes up, you want to consult and figure out, well, what can we do to help? How can I empower myself as a parent and get more so maybe I can be more helpful? And we want to, again, remove sharp objects and discuss any safety concerns and come up with maybe a contractor plan if it raises. So again, imminent issues are where there's an immediate danger to self, and that's, I want to end my life now. I can't keep myself safe. I don't know if I'm coming back, or you see signs. There's immediate danger to others, where you hear that they're going to do something to someone else that involves taking their life or risk, or they're not acting like themselves, this is not your child in front of you. They're slurring their words, they're not thinking, they're speaking so fast and have all these ideas, and they're taking off their clothes and running around. They're gravely disabled. That's a red hot issue. When it's a red hot, there's no choice. We need to go for an evaluation and we're not letting you be alone. No, I'm going to just go call my friends and take a drive. If they're a red hot, they're not getting behind the wheel, because part of being a red hot, that decision making is not good and offline. And so we need to kind of be that for our teen in that moment until they have their smart brain back. So now that you're starting to get a sense of the range of things and how to kind of think about it and what you might want to ask, here's some tips to help ask the questions and things to think about as parents. So the first one is how we determine ourselves, just so you know, there's no mystery, when something's a red hot issue. So the first thing is we have to ask about thoughts of hurting ourselves or taking our own life and around safety. I share with you how I do it, but I'll repeat it. And in that sense, I'm concerned, I'm seeing X, Y, Z. When that happens, sometimes we have thoughts about taking our own life. Have you had any of those thoughts? Based on that, yes or no, then we're going to ask further questions. So one of the first questions is, what kind of thoughts are you having? So we can have thoughts like, I wish I were dead, which are more passive. I wish I would go to sleep and not wake up in the morning. Passive. If it's active, I want to drive my car off a cliff. I want to get hit by a car. I want to do these things. That's active. And active ideation is much more concerning. If there's active ideation, or either way, do you want to act on those thoughts? So you might have thoughts pop in your head. We can have all sorts of thoughts. I can have thoughts about running out of here right now. Can pop in my head, but am I going to want to act on that thought? Can I keep myself from acting on that thought? Is a big thing. If I can't, that's what makes it a red hot issue. If I can, it's still red, but it's medium. If I can keep myself from acting on it, we still want to be concerned and help build a team, but we don't have to be as concerned as if I can't keep myself from doing it. And then it goes from there. If you now have active thoughts and intention, do you have a plan? So part of that plan is how quick and what is the plan, and we think about how lethal is the plan and what the plan is about. But if they have a plan, we're already in the medium. If the plan is this week or tonight, now it's red hot. And also we're asking and thinking about how lethal is that plan. So these are all some of the questions you could think about putting in your repertoire, but moving in that fashion of not just jumping to what's your plan. You can see how it's a little bit of a progression. First, are you having thoughts? Tell me about the thoughts. What kind of thoughts? And then from there, how serious can you stop yourself from doing those thoughts? And then do you have a plan to them? And how imminent is the plan? And if they started to make way to make the plan happen, it's much more of a red hot. So if I've started to collect the firearms, if I've started to write the notes, it's much more concerning. And again, if you don't feel like you can do that with your teen, the challenge is you can't, it's on you then to find someone who can. It's not okay in that sense. If you start seeing some of these indicators now, or some of the shutdown in multiple areas of life, it's really important to start to recognize what color are we in. And that color can change quickly in adolescence. So, and remember the other thing, most people, when you ask these kinds of questions, they actually experience relief by asking. You're not planting a seed in your teen's brain by asking some of these questions. That's not how this works. So it's really important to know it's okay, and if they say no and you believe them, that's a relief, and now you know you're dealing with a different color. But if you can't get a no, you need to still be concerned. Or if you're seeing signs, you can't trust them. So part of what happens a lot in teenage years is, now we're going to switch from a little bit more, we've been on the really heavy side, and these are just some tips to help in conversations. So teens, and you see this in movies and that as well, but they're very notorious for giving one-word answers. How was your day? Good. How was school? Fine. How was the party? Fun. And so I call those, and I tell my teens in session, my kids, I call those door closers. They shut down a conversation. So I teach them, we need to have door openers. Door openers keep conversations going, and I need to have at least 2 sentences, and feel free to ask a follow-up question to me, and that's called a conversation, or at least 2 sentences minimum when I ask you a question. So then it becomes, oh, that was a good door closer, time to give me a door opener. So it's a useful way to kind of help extend conversations, but it's also a useful social skill for teens to be working on as they try to learn how to talk and navigate with other teens. The art of conversation is talking and sharing in at least 2 sentences, and then usually a follow-up related question. So they might laugh and eye roll, but they get it, and eventually you get more of these door openers. And if you want it to be there in teenage years, guess when it should start? Early. Don't start in the teenage years if you have a middle school or elementary. Start practicing these skills now. Start helping have conversations. Have them learn how to do that. So that's one tip. Second tip is, it's time, my grandma used to joke, and she would say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And a lot of time as parents, we want to problem solve, we want to talk, but the most powerful thing you can do is listen. And so an acronym for that is have some heart. Really hear and listen to what your child is saying. And instead of trying to talk back or solving the problem, here's the words that I would encourage you to come out of your mouth. Tell me more about that. Thank you for sharing. I'm glad to hear what's going on. So not telling them, no, how dumb, why'd you do that? What happened? I can't believe it. Or what about that? Weren't you thinking about that? That's going to shut down conversations. That's you as a parent closing the door. You want to also open the door and try it. If all you have in your repertoire is, I hear you telling me, thank you for sharing, is there anything more you want me to know? And not just with your teens, try it with people you love. Listen, open that up. Try to empathize, try to understand what they need, and then figure out how to help them get where they want to go. And consult as you need if you get concerned or worried about what you're hearing. This is my favorite kind of what I talk about. So I call it chicken soup. It's a really good tool for relationships. And here's what I mean by chicken soup. If you went up to 5 people right now and you said, my throat's hurting, I'm kind of have a cold, what kind of advice would you get from them? So from my cultural heritage, you gotta have the chicken soup. Why aren't you having your chicken soup? Other cultures, it might be, You need to sleep off a cold. You need to starve a cold. You should exercise. You should have that osteomycin. Why don't you have more vitamins? Whatever it might be. But what I want you to understand by chicken soup and why I call it that way, we believe in this idea. I'm a human being, you're a human being. If this is what helps me with being sick, this is what's going to help you. So we work on the transitive property. So we're always giving advice based on the transitive property or reacting based on that. And we don't just do that with colds. We do that with feelings. So if you're having a rough day, your partner or your teen is having a rough day, and talking about it helps you feel better, guess what you're going to try to do with your teen? You're going to try to talk to them because that's going to help them feel better. Another one, if a hug helps you feel better and when you hear some really awful news, you're going to give a hug when someone's telling you awful news. That's chicken soup. And if you understand chicken soup, it leads to two things. A, when you're going through an emotional state, you have to learn to tell people what you need to help you through that emotional state. I'm having a rough day at work. I need to come home. I need to vent about it. And then I need to watch some TV and get a kiss. Or I'm having a rough day. I don't want to talk about it. I'm going to go walk the dog and cool off. And then let's just have fun. Or I'm having a rough day and I don't know what I'm going to do. I need to figure out how to problem solve my game plan. And if you really think about your experience, most of the time we don't want problem solving. But so much of what we give is problem solving and solution. And that's where you kind of can lose your team too, because they're, as I said, they're trying to develop their own sense of what's right and wrong. They don't want to hear your moral compass in the same way anymore. They want to develop their own moral compass. So part of chicken soup is learning when you need something to ask, and when you're trying to tell, and when you're trying to help, ask. I see you're having a rough day. How can I help? I see you're having a rough day. Do you have an idea what could help right now? And if they say no, here are some things that help me. Could that help you? And if you don't know what you need, a good way to think about it or figure it out is ask yourself, what would I give if the shoe's on the other foot? And that's probably what you need in a situation. So you can also ask your team that. What would you need if Johnny was having the same day you had? What would you do for him? That's probably what they need. But don't try to jump to problem solving, and don't try in that way to give them what you need. And this will make you more successful, not just with your team, but in all relationships. So I'm a little bit dorky, and part of being dorky, I have a psychologist hall of fame. And one person in my hall of fame is this guy named Irving Yalom. And Yalom has this concept. He calls it strike when the iron is cold. As a parent, you don't, or anytime, when you're in the middle of a fight or when tensions are high, that's not the time to have these really big conversations about things. Because what happens in our brain is when we're emotionally overwhelmed, our frontal lobe shuts down. If we're too anxious, if we're too angry, this part of our brain that we need for good conversation shuts down. And so no good conversation can happen. They can't literally think. So in that sense, that's when in these bigger situations, when the iron is hot, you want to execute plans, not create plans. That's why you want to have some of these conversations now. What would we do if we get in this situation? What do you want me to do if you're feeling this way? What's our plan? So when we get there, we execute. But if things are really hot and tensions are high, stop talking, take a time out, stay with them. Let's not talk. We need to calm down before we can keep talking. We need to have our smart brains back. We need to know how to do that. So in that sense, that involves both the timing, having conversations not in that moment, learning when things are good to have some of those conversations, or setting aside a weekly time. Every week, we're going to have some time where we talk about the tough stuff and we're prepared. Maybe before we went out for a good dinner and we're feeling good, and now we have that time where we talk about the tough stuff. And it's not always good to bring it up anytime, so it's prepared, and we try to work through it and come up with these plans to then execute in these other times. So I just kind of talked to you about, you really want to have those conversations with their smart brain and not with their emotion brain. So having that time, but having ways that get your smart brain back. Breathing is one, visual, there's a lot of different ones, but in that sense, being able to make sure and recognize when they're getting too heated or overwhelmed and stop talking. Take a break, cool down, come back, and then have the conversation. So a lot of information. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing pretty good. A lot of information. And so what are the next steps? So now you sort of know more about adolescence, why it's more of a challenge in time, how some of the issues can go in the mental health world. You have some idea of how to figure out risk, how to have some of these conversations. So now I'm going to challenge you. I come also from the world of education in the military, and part of that is if you don't have an acronym, it just doesn't exist. So I had to come up with that acronym that helped fit. So I'm going to challenge you to ACT. And ACT is, I want to learn to assess, which is all most of this talk was about. Learning how to get more comfortable assessing, looking for things, having conversations. And then when you assess, then learning in that way to try to assess the depth of the issues, assess what kinds of issues, how far it goes, and if you're stuck, remember trying to consult. You want to challenge beliefs that don't fit, that aren't true, that their teen is learning, such that, oh, there's no harm to using pot right now in my brain, I don't know what you're talking about. You can look it up. It's not good for the adolescent brain. It's just not. And you can kind of challenge and work with them. And in that sense, you can challenge beliefs about therapy. It's not, the really bad thing about therapy is any show that has a therapist in it, we're either doing something nefarious, we're trying to sleep with you, we're making you sit on a couch, we're hypnotizing you, we're stealing your money, we're recording you. All these things that make therapy look horrible. And it's really sad. I just watched Shameless, one of my favorite shows. Whole arc of the show is about one of the doctors doing all these things, psychologists. So having an accurate vision of what therapy is, and now it's much more where we teach you things. You learn things. We practice these things in a supportive environment and relationship. And it's not just you sitting there spilling your guts and then saying, go on your way. It's different now. And we work in that sense, and we have more so helping challenge some of those beliefs. There's a lot of belief around the stigma. What if my friends know? And you can challenge some of that. So learning to ask questions about what are you concerned about? I do. I have some teens who come to my office, and the teens are so worried about their friends because they all share their locations. They literally turn off their phones because they don't want anyone to know where they're going. And that's the stigma, but it's about how do that's part of this talk, how do we break that stigma and get help and say it's okay that we deal with these things and take that back. So we can challenge, you can teach a little more. Anything you learned here, you take that time to teach it, to help your teen understand it, and to work through. Teach them about chicken soup. How better would your relationship have been if you were a teenager and you learned about that? How much better would it have been if they learned how to have these conversations, if they learned how to talk about their emotions and different things? So facilitate that. Help them practice. Do it with you. And then remember, part of what being a good teacher is to hold them accountable. So if they promise something and they say they're going to do it, part of teenage years is learning to verify. Don't just take their word, learn to verify. And if you keep verifying and their word is good, they have earned trust bank account status and you don't have to. But if you keep verifying and you don't see, they don't have that trust, and keep verifying. So if they say, I'm going to talk to my teacher, how can you verify? They're going to say, I'm going to talk to the counselor. I'm going to do these things. Have a system to help verify so you know whether they're at that point where you can really trust them. Remember, it's a skill, and if you want to get comfortable with the skill, you got to practice. And if you want to be able to use that skill in game time conditions, you have to practice enough so you're executing, and you don't want the first time you ask this question to be when you're really concerned about your teen and you don't know if they're safe. So thank you, but let's kind of go. I want to make sure learning occurred. One thing someone might stop doing, one thing you're patting yourself on your back about, one thing you might start doing based on this conversation today.